The final assault began at dawn on the fourth day, and it was unlike anything Sarah had seen during the previous 72 hours of siege warfare. Instead of the methodical, systematic attacks that had characterized the enemy's previous efforts, this was an all-out offensive designed to overwhelm the base's defenses through sheer volume and intensity. Sarah was in the cockpit of her fighter aircraft, engines running and weapons loaded, when the enemy bombardment began. The artillery barrage was 3 times more intense than anything they had experienced before, with shells falling across every section of the base perimeter simultaneously. The ground shook so violently that she could feel it through her aircraft's landing gear, and the noise was so overwhelming that radio communication became difficult. Major Richard's voice came through her headset, barely audible over the sound of explosions. All Falcon flights, enemy main assault has begun. Intelligence estimates 8,000 hostile troops attacking from all directions simultaneously. This is their final push, and they're throwing everything they have at us. 8,000 enemy soldiers against 3,000 defenders who had already taken significant casualties over the past 3 days. The numbers were not encouraging, but Sarah had learned that numbers meant less than determination, training, and effective use of available resources. The enemy had more troops, but the defenders had better defensive positions, superior air power, and the motivation that came from fighting for their own survival. From her position on the flight line, Sarah could see the enemy assault developing across the entire perimeter. Hundreds of infantry soldiers were advancing under cover of the artillery barrage, supported by tanks, armored personnel carriers, and mobile artillery pieces. This was not a probing attack or a limited objective assault. This was an attempt to completely overrun forward operating base Falcon and eliminate everyone inside it. Falcon Flight, you are cleared for immediate takeoff, came the urgent order from air traffic control. Proceed to assigned sectors and begin close air support operations immediately. Ground forces are reporting enemy penetrations at multiple locations. Sarah's assigned sector was the northwestern perimeter, where intelligence indicated the enemy was making their main effort with concentrated armor and infantry. As she climbed away from the base and turned toward her target area, she could see the scope of the assault unfolding below her. Enemy forces were attacking simultaneously from north, south, east, and west, creating a coordinated offensive that stretched the defenders' capabilities to their absolute limits. Lieutenant Morrison was flying as her wingman, having requested the assignment because of their successful partnership during previous missions. Over the past 3 days, they had developed the kind of tactical understanding that allowed them to coordinate complex attacks with minimal radio communication, reading each other's intentions, and adapting to changing situations almost instinctively. The northwestern sector was a scene of chaos when they arrived. Sarah could see enemy tanks advancing across open ground toward defensive positions that were already under heavy artillery fire. Infantry soldiers were following close behind the armor, using the tanks for cover while advancing toward the base perimeter. Defensive positions were returning fire, but they appeared to be outnumbered by at least 3 to 1. Ground Pounder 2, this is Falcon Lead, Sarah announced, having been designated as mission commander for this flight due to her proven performance during previous operations. We have visual contact with heavy enemy armor in your sector. Request immediate target priorities and friendly position updates. The response came from a ground commander whose voice carried the stress and urgency of someone whose position was being overrun. Falcon Lead, we have approximately 20 enemy tanks advancing on our positions from the northwest. Our anti-tank weapons are running low on ammunition, and we need immediate air support, or we're going to be overrun. 20 enemy tanks represented a significant threat that could break through the defensive line and enable enemy infantry to flood into the base interior. Sarah immediately began planning multiple attack runs that would eliminate the armor threat while avoiding friendly casualties and maintaining coordination with Morrison's aircraft. Falcon 2, we'll attack in coordinated pairs, Sarah instructed Morrison. I'll take the lead tanks. You take the trailing vehicles. Multiple attack runs will be required to eliminate all targets. Sarah's first attack run targeted the 3 lead enemy tanks, which were approaching within 500 meters of the defensive positions. Her missiles struck all 3 targets successfully, creating massive explosions that stopped the enemy advance temporarily and gave the ground forces time to reposition and resupply their anti-tank weapons. Morrison's attack was equally successful, eliminating 2 more enemy tanks and damaging a third. However, their presence over the target area had attracted intense anti-aircraft fire from enemy positions, and both aircraft were now maneuvering violently to avoid surface-to-air missiles and artillery rounds that were being fired in their direction. Falcon lead, multiple missile launches from enemy positions, Morrison announced. I count at least 4 SAM systems active in our target area. Sarah had expected heavy air defenses during the final assault, but the enemy had clearly positioned more anti-aircraft systems than intelligence had detected. Flying close air support missions in this environment would require perfect coordination, aggressive maneuvering, and more than a little luck to avoid being shot down. Their second coordinated attack eliminated 5 more enemy tanks, but it also revealed that enemy forces had established anti-aircraft positions throughout the area surrounding the base. Sarah's aircraft was hit by small arms fire during her attack run, with several rounds penetrating non-critical areas of her airframe. Warning lights illuminated on her instrument panel, but all essential systems continued functioning normally. Falcon lead, what's your aircraft status? Morrison asked, having observed the tracers and impacts around her aircraft. Minor damage, all systems operational, Sarah replied while scanning her instruments to verify that assessment. Continue with planned attacks until all enemy armor is neutralized. The battle continued for over 2 hours, with Sarah and Morrison making repeated attack runs against enemy positions throughout the northwestern sector. Their efforts were successful in stopping the enemy armored assault, but they were also taking continuous damage from ground fire and surface-to-air missiles. During her 6th attack run, Sarah's aircraft was hit by a surface-to-air missile that caused significant damage to her left engine and several control systems. Warning alarms filled her cockpit, and she found herself fighting to maintain control of an aircraft that was no longer responding normally to her control inputs. Falcon lead, you're trailing smoke, and your left engine appears to be on fire, Morrison announced urgently. Recommend immediate return to base for emergency landing. Sarah checked her engine instruments and confirmed that her left engine was indeed on fire and would need to be shut down immediately. Flying on a single engine while maintaining combat operations was possible, but it significantly reduced her aircraft's performance and increased the risk of catastrophic failure. Falcon 2, I'm shutting down the damaged engine and returning to base, Sarah announced. Continue close air support operations in this sector. Ground forces still need air cover to hold their positions. The flight back to base on a single engine gave Sarah time to assess the overall tactical situation, and what she saw was both encouraging and terrifying. Enemy forces had been stopped at the perimeter in most locations, but they were continuing to attack with desperate intensity. The defenders were holding their positions, but casualties were mounting and ammunition supplies were reaching critically low levels. Landing a damaged aircraft during an active battle required careful coordination with air traffic control and ground crews who were simultaneously managing multiple aircraft operations, artillery impacts, and the constant stream of vehicles supporting the defensive effort. Sarah executed a perfect single-engine landing despite the challenging circumstances, demonstrating the flying skills that had made her one of the squadron's most reliable pilots. Sergeant Martinez was waiting with a damage assessment team when she shut down her aircraft. The missile hit had caused extensive damage to the left engine and several flight control systems, but the aircraft could be repaired and returned to service within several hours if they had the necessary spare parts and tools. How bad is it, Sergeant? Sarah asked as she climbed out of the cockpit and began removing her flight gear. Bad enough that you're lucky to be alive, Captain, Martinez replied. That missile came within inches of hitting something that would have brought you down immediately. But we can fix it, and we'll have you back in the air before sunset if the battle's still going on. As Sarah walked toward the operations center for debriefing, she could see that the intensity of the enemy assault was beginning to decrease. Artillery fire was less frequent, small arms fire was more sporadic, and the radio chatter suggested that enemy forces were beginning to withdraw from some sectors after taking heavy casualties. Major Richards was coordinating air operations for the entire base when she arrived, but he took time to personally debrief her mission and assess her aircraft damage. "Outstanding work out there, Captain," he said. "Your section eliminated over 15 enemy tanks and probably saved the northwestern perimeter from being overrun." "What's the overall situation, sir?" Sarah asked. "Are we holding?" "We're holding, and the enemy assault appears to be running out of steam," Richards replied. "They've taken massive casualties over the past 4 hours, and intelligence by the third day of the siege, Sarah had flown 8 combat missions and had become the pilot that other aircrews looked to for guidance on close air support tactics. The transformation from anxious newcomer to seasoned combat veteran had happened faster than anyone could have predicted, forged in the crucible of continuous operations under the most demanding circumstances imaginable. The tactical situation had evolved into a deadly stalemate. Enemy forces had been unable to break through the base's defensive perimeter despite 3 days of continuous assault, but the defenders were taking steady casualties and running low on critical supplies. Ammunition, fuel, and medical supplies were all reaching critically low levels, while enemy reinforcements continued to arrive from the surrounding mountains. Sarah was awakened before dawn by Lieutenant Morrison, who was shaking her shoulder gently but persistently. She had managed only 3 hours of sleep between missions, catching brief naps whenever the operational tempo allowed. Her flight suit was wrinkled and stained with sweat, her hair was matted under her flight helmet, and she could feel the accumulated fatigue that came from flying multiple combat missions per day. "Captain, they need us for an emergency close air support mission," Morrison said quietly. "Enemy forces have broken through the eastern perimeter, and ground troops are in danger of being overrun." Sarah was fully awake immediately, the adrenaline of combat operations overriding her body's need for rest. She had learned to function on minimal sleep, maximum stress, and the constant awareness that people were depending on her performance to stay alive. The luxury of feeling tired would have to wait until the battle was over. The operations center was even busier than usual, with staff officers coordinating what appeared to be a desperate attempt to contain the enemy breakthrough. Major Richards looked like he had not slept at all in the past 72 hours, but his voice remained calm and authoritative as he briefed the available pilots on the emergency mission. "The enemy has managed to penetrate our defensive line at Checkpoint 7, Richards explained, pointing to an area on the tactical map that Sarah knew had been under heavy pressure for the past 2 days. "They have approximately 200 infantry supported by light armor inside our perimeter, and they're advancing toward the flight line and operations center." Sarah felt a chill as she realized the implications. If enemy forces reached the flight line, they could destroy the aircraft that were providing critical air support for the entire defensive operation. Without air cover, the remaining defensive positions would be quickly overwhelmed by the superior numbers of attacking forces. Ground forces are attempting to contain the breakthrough, but they need immediate air support to stop the enemy advance before it reaches critical facilities, Richards continued. "This is not a normal close air support mission. You'll be attacking enemy forces that are inside our own perimeter, in close proximity to friendly positions and vital base infrastructure." The mission requirements were unprecedented in Sarah's experience. Instead of flying to distant target areas and attacking clearly identified enemy positions, she would be providing air support for a firefight that was taking place virtually outside the operations center where she was receiving her briefing. Captain Williams would again be leading the mission, paired with Sarah as his wingman. Their assignment was to attack the enemy forces that had penetrated the perimeter while avoiding any damage to friendly forces or base facilities. The margin for error was essentially non-existent, because a single targeting mistake could result in devastating friendly casualties. As they conducted their pre-flight preparations, Sarah could hear the sounds of ground combat getting closer to the flight line. Small arms fire was clearly audible, along with the distinctive sounds of rocket-propelled grenades and hand grenades exploding. The base's defensive plan had always assumed that enemy forces would be stopped at the perimeter. Fighting inside the base itself had not been extensively rehearsed. Sergeant Martinez was waiting by her aircraft with obvious concern on his weathered face. "Captain, I've never had to prep an aircraft for a mission like this," he said. "You'll be flying over our own people, attacking enemies who are mixed in with friendlies. Please be careful out there. Sarah completed her pre-flight inspection with extra attention to detail, knowing that equipment malfunction during this mission could have catastrophic consequences. As she climbed into her cockpit, she could see muzzle flashes and explosions in the distance, marking the locations where soldiers were fighting for control of her base. The takeoff was routine, but everything changed as soon as they were airborne. Instead of flying toward distant target areas, Williams led them in a tight circle around the base perimeter, allowing them to observe the tactical situation from above while remaining within immediate response range of the ground forces. From altitude, Sarah could see the enemy break through clearly. A ragged line of enemy soldiers was advancing across the base's interior areas, moving from building to building while engaging defensive positions that had been hastily established to contain their advance. Friendly forces appeared to be falling back toward the central area of the base, trading space for time while waiting for air support to arrive. Ground Pounder 7, this is Falcon Flight overhead, Williams announced on the tactical frequency. We have visual contact with enemy forces inside the perimeter. Request immediate guidance on friendly positions and clearance for close air support. The response came immediately, with obvious stress and urgency in the ground commander's voice. Falcon Flight, friendly forces are marked with orange smoke. Everything between the orange smoke and the eastern fence line is enemy territory. You are cleared to engage any targets in that area, but be extremely careful of our positions. Sarah could see the orange smoke grenades that marked friendly positions, creating a clear line of demarcation between areas where airstrikes were safe and areas where they might cause friendly casualties. The enemy forces were clearly visible moving between buildings and defensive positions, but they were close enough to friendly troops that precision would be absolutely critical. Williams began his attack run against a group of enemy soldiers who were advancing toward a fuel storage area. His weapons struck precisely on target, eliminating the immediate threat without causing any apparent damage to base facilities or friendly forces. However, the explosion attracted attention from enemy air defense systems that had been brought inside the perimeter during the breakthrough. Falcon 4, missile launch from inside the base, Williams announced urgently. Evasive maneuvers immediately. Sarah found herself being shot at by missiles that were being fired from inside her own base, an experience that was both surreal and terrifying. She executed defensive maneuvers while trying to avoid flying over friendly positions, creating a complex three-dimensional problem that required split-second decisions and perfect aircraft control. The missile missed, but it had come close enough to remind both pilots that they were operating in an extremely dangerous environment where threats could come from unexpected directions. Enemy forces inside the base perimeter had access to portable air defense systems that could be fired from concealed positions with very little warning. Sarah's first attack run targeted an enemy position that had been established in a maintenance hangar near the flight line. Her missiles struck the building precisely, eliminating the enemy position while causing minimal damage to the surrounding facilities. However, the explosion revealed additional enemy forces that had been concealed in nearby buildings. Falcon Flight, we have more enemy positions than initially estimated, came the update from ground forces. Looks like approximately 300 enemy soldiers made it through the perimeter, not the 200 we originally reported. The increased enemy numbers meant that the air support mission would be longer and more complex than originally planned. Sarah and Williams would need to make multiple attack runs against different targets while maintaining constant awareness of friendly positions and base facilities that needed protection. During her second attack run, Sarah targeted a group of enemy soldiers who were attempting to capture the base's communications center. The building was critical to coordinating defensive operations, and its loss would significantly complicate efforts to contain the enemy breakthrough. Her attack was successful, but it also revealed how close enemy forces had come to overrunning vital base facilities. The mission continued for over an hour, with both pilots making repeated attacks against enemy positions throughout the base interior. Each attack run required careful coordination with ground forces, precise target identification, and perfect weapons delivery to avoid friendly casualties. The stress of flying multiple precision attacks in such close proximity to friendly forces was unlike anything Sarah had experienced in training. As the enemy advance was gradually contained and then pushed back toward the perimeter, Sarah began to understand how much the tactical situation had changed over the past 3 days. What had started as a conventional siege with clearly defined battle lines had evolved into a complex urban warfare scenario where friendly and enemy forces were intermixed throughout the base. During their final attack run, Williams and Sarah coordinated simultaneous strikes against the remaining enemy forces near the eastern perimeter. Their weapons eliminated the last organized enemy resistance inside the base, allowing friendly ground forces to begin the process of re-establishing defensive positions and treating casualties. Falcon Flight, outstanding work, came the message from ground control. Enemy breakthrough has been contained, and all remaining hostile forces have been eliminated or have withdrawn beyond the perimeter. Return to base for refuel and rearm. As they approached for landing, Sarah could see the damage that 3 days of siege warfare had inflicted on forward operating base Falcon. Multiple buildings showed battle damage from artillery and small arms fire. Vehicle hulks were scattered around the perimeter where previous enemy attacks had been repelled, and smoke was still rising from several locations. The flight line itself had been damaged during the enemy breakthrough, with several aircraft showing bullet holes and shrapnel damage from the fighting that had taken place nearby. Ground crews were already working to repair the damage and prepare aircraft for continued operations, but it was clear that the base's defensive capabilities had been significantly degraded. Major Richards was waiting for them in the operations center, looking exhausted, but relieved that the immediate crisis had been resolved. That was exceptional flying under the most difficult circumstances imaginable, he told Sarah and Williams during their post-mission debriefing. You managed to provide precision air support in an urban environment without causing a single friendly casualty. Sarah felt a sense of professional satisfaction at having successfully completed such a challenging mission, but she also understood that the broader tactical situation remained critical. Enemy forces were still surrounding the base. Relief forces had not yet arrived, and supplies were continuing to dwindle despite successful defense of the perimeter. "What's the overall situation, sir?" she asked. "How much longer do we need to hold out?" "Intelligence estimates that relief forces will reach us within the next 24 to 48 hours, Richards replied. "But the enemy knows that too, and they're likely to make one more major assault before reinforcements arrive. We need to be ready for whatever they throw at us next." As Sarah walked back to her quarters to grab food and a few hours of sleep, she reflected on how much her understanding of combat aviation had evolved over the past 3 days. She had started the siege as an inexperienced pilot worried about proving herself in her first combat mission. Now she was a seasoned veteran who had successfully completed some of the most challenging close air support missions possible. The other pilots in the squadron now looked to her for advice on tactics and procedures, recognizing that her quick adaptation to combat operations and her success in high-stress situations made her a valuable source of knowledge. Lieutenant Morrison had specifically requested to fly as her wingman on future missions, saying that he learned more from flying with her than from any training exercise. But Sarah also understood that her personal success was meaningless if the base fell to enemy forces. The siege of forward operating base Falcon was far from over, and the most difficult challenges were probably still ahead. Enemy forces were likely planning one final, desperate assault designed to overwhelm the defenders before relief forces could arrive. When that assault came, Sarah would be ready. She had proven to herself and others that she could perform under the most demanding circumstances possible. Her gender, her inexperience, and her previous concerns about acceptance by her fellow pilots had all become irrelevant in the face of combat performance and professional competence. The transformation that had begun with her first combat mission was now complete. Captain Sarah Chun was no longer the anxious pilot who had worried about fitting in with her squadron. She was a combat veteran who had earned her place through skill, courage, and dedication to the mission that all of them shared, defending their base and bringing everyone home safely. The final test was coming, and she was ready for whatever the enemy might throw at them. 18 hours after her first combat mission, Sarah was awakened by the unmistakable sound of incoming artillery fire. The base's emergency alarm system was blaring, red lights were flashing in the hallways, and the voice over the public address system was announcing what everyone had been expecting. All personnel to battle stations. We are under attack. This is not a drill. Sarah rolled out of her bunk fully clothed, having learned to sleep in her flight suit during times of heightened alert. Outside her small quarters, she could hear the sounds of 3,000 military personnel responding to the crisis with the efficiency that came from extensive training and preparation. Boots pounded on concrete floors, orders were being shouted, and the entire base was transforming from a peacetime installation into a combat fortress. The first explosions had been distant, probably enemy artillery targeting the perimeter defenses to soften them up before a ground assault. But as Sarah grabbed her flight gear and headed toward the operations center, the impacts were getting closer and more intense. Windows rattled, dust fell from the ceiling, and the lights flickered each time a shell exploded nearby. The operations center was a controlled chaos of activity when she arrived. Major Richards was coordinating air defense operations while simultaneously planning close air support missions for the ground forces that would soon be engaged in direct combat with enemy infantry and armor. Large display screens showed the tactical situation in real time, with red indicators marking enemy positions and blue markers tracking friendly forces. "Captain Chun, glad you're here," Richards called out as she entered. "We need every pilot ready for immediate launch. The enemy has begun their main assault, and our ground forces are going to need continuous air support to hold their positions." Sarah could see Lieutenant Morrison and the other pilots studying mission briefs and checking equipment. The relaxed atmosphere of the previous day's pre-flight preparations had been replaced by the urgent intensity of warriors preparing for a battle that would determine whether they lived or died. "What's the tactical situation, sir?" Sarah asked, joining the group around the mission planning table. "Enemy forces began their assault approximately 30 minutes ago with a massive artillery barrage focused on our perimeter defenses," Richards explained, pointing to areas on the tactical map where red indicators showed enemy activity. "Initial reports suggest they're attacking from 3 directions simultaneously, with their main effort coming from the north where they have the best terrain for their armored vehicles." The plan was both simple and terrifying in its implications. The enemy had spent weeks positioning approximately 5,000 troops in carefully chosen locations around forward operating base Falcon. Now they were launching a coordinated assault designed to overwhelm the base's defenses through sheer numbers and firepower. The 3,000 defenders would need to hold their positions long enough for relief forces to arrive, but that could take anywhere from 3 to 7 days, depending on how quickly higher headquarters could organize and deploy reinforcements. "Our mission," Richards continued, "is to provide close air support for our ground forces, with particular emphasis on enemy armor and artillery positions that pose the greatest threat to our defensive lines. We'll be operating in flights of 2 aircraft, with continuous coverage over the battle area for as long as our fuel and ammunition supplies last." Sarah studied the mission assignments and felt her stomach tighten when she saw her name paired with Captain Williams for the first close air support mission of the battle. Williams was a veteran pilot with extensive combat experience, but he was also known for being extremely aggressive in his tactical approach. Flying as his wingman would mean following him into situations that pushed the limits of acceptable risk. "Captain Williams and Captain Chun, you'll launch in 15 minutes, Richards announced. "Your assigned sector is the northern perimeter where enemy armor is making their main effort. Ground forces are reporting multiple tanks and armored personnel carriers approaching their positions, and they need immediate air support to prevent a breakthrough." Sarah nodded, feeling the familiar pre-mission nervousness combined with the new sensation of knowing that friendly soldiers were counting on her performance to stay alive. This wasn't a mission against a communications facility or a supply depot. This was direct support for infantry who were probably already taking casualties and desperately needed help. The launch preparation felt different from the previous day's routine. Ground crews were working with urgent efficiency, loading maximum ordnance loads and topping off fuel tanks while constantly looking over their shoulders at the explosions that were getting closer to the flight line. Air traffic control was coordinating multiple aircraft movements while monitoring enemy air defense activity and tracking incoming artillery rounds. As Sarah climbed into her cockpit and began the startup sequence, she could hear the sounds of battle growing more intense. Heavy machine gun fire was audible between artillery explosions, suggesting that enemy ground forces had reached the perimeter and were engaging in direct firefights with the base defenders. Radio chatter included urgent requests for medical evacuation, ammunition resupply, and close air support. Falcon 3 and 4, you are cleared for immediate takeoff, came the announcement from Control Tower. Proceed directly to target area and contact ground forces on tactical frequency for close air support coordination. The takeoff felt different from any training exercise Sarah had ever participated in. As they climbed away from the base, she could see muzzle flashes and explosions across the defensive perimeter. Smoke was rising from multiple locations, and the carefully planned defensive positions were beginning to blur into the chaos of active combat. Captain Williams led them directly toward the northern sector where the heaviest fighting was reported. Falcon 4, we're going to be operating at low altitude in close proximity to friendly forces, he announced through the radio. Maximum precision is required, and we need to be absolutely certain of target identification before releasing any ordnance. Sarah acknowledged the warning while scanning the ground below for signs of enemy activity. Close air support was one of the most challenging mission types in military aviation, requiring pilots to distinguish between friendly and enemy forces while flying at high speed in a combat environment. The margin for error was essentially zero, because mistakes could result in friendly casualties that might be worse than having no air support at all. Falcon Flight, this is Ground Pounder 6, came a new voice on the tactical frequency. We have multiple enemy tanks moving toward our positions from the northwest. Request immediate air support before they break through our defensive line. Sarah could hear the stress and urgency in the ground commander's voice. Somewhere below, soldiers were fighting for their lives against superior numbers and heavy armor, and their survival depended on the precision and effectiveness of the air support she and Williams were about to provide. Williams banked sharply toward the reported enemy positions, and Sarah followed him while scanning the ground for the targets the infantry commander had described. The terrain was rough and broken, with scattered vegetation that provided excellent concealment for both friendly and enemy forces. Distinguishing between the two would require careful observation and constant communication with ground units. Falcon 4, I have visual contact with enemy armor, Williams announced. Approximately 12 o'clock from your position, 3 tanks moving in column formation toward our defensive positions. Sarah adjusted her flight path and immediately spotted the enemy vehicles Williams had identified. 3 tanks were indeed moving across open ground toward the base perimeter, their main guns firing toward concealed defensive positions while their machine guns sprayed, covering fire. They were still approximately 2 kilometers from the friendly positions, providing a reasonable margin of safety for air attacks. Ground Pounder 6, confirm that all friendly forces are south of the creek line, Williams requested, referring to a terrain feature that would serve as a reference point for distinguishing between friendly and enemy positions. Confirmed, Falcon Flight. All friendlies are south of the creek. You are cleared to engage any targets north of that line. Williams began his attack run immediately, diving toward the lead enemy tank, while Sarah maintained altitude to provide cover and backup attack capability. She watched his missiles streak toward the target, striking the tank, and erupting in a massive explosion that sent smoke and flames hundreds of feet into the air. Falcon 4, you're cleared to engage the second tank, Williams announced as he climbed away from the target area. I'll provide cover and watch for additional threats. Sarah rolled into her own attack run, focusing on the second tank in the column while monitoring her instruments and the tactical situation. The enemy vehicle was moving rapidly toward cover, its commander clearly recognizing the air threat and attempting to escape. Sarah had only one opportunity to achieve a successful attack before the tank reached concealment behind a ridge line. Her missiles guided perfectly to the target, striking the tank's main armor and destroying it completely. The explosion was even larger than Williams' hit, suggesting that she had struck the vehicle's ammunition storage and caused a secondary detonation that eliminated any possibility of survival for the crew. Outstanding shooting, Falcon 4, Williams commented. Let's find that third tank before it reaches our defensive positions. The third enemy tank had indeed continued moving toward the base perimeter and was now much closer to friendly positions, making an air attack significantly more dangerous for both the ground forces and the attacking aircraft. Sarah could see infantry soldiers moving in the area, making target identification more complex and requiring extreme precision to avoid friendly casualties. Ground Pounder 6, third enemy tank is now approximately 500 meters from your positions, Williams announced. Can you mark your locations with smoke to assist with target identification? Within seconds, colored smoke grenades began detonating near the friendly positions, creating clear visual references that would help the pilots distinguish between friendly and enemy forces. The enemy tank was clearly visible moving between the marked friendly positions and the base perimeter, presenting a challenging but achievable target. Williams' second attack was perfectly executed, with his missiles striking the tank just as it was beginning to fire toward the defensive positions. The explosion eliminated the immediate threat to the ground forces and completed their primary mission objective. However, their success had not gone unnoticed by enemy forces. As they climbed away from the target area, Sarah's radar warning receiver began indicating that surface-to-air missiles were tracking their aircraft. The enemy had clearly positioned air defense systems to protect their ground forces, and those systems were now actively trying to shoot down the aircraft that had just destroyed 3 of their tanks. Falcon 4, we have missile launch indication, Williams announced. Execute evasive maneuvers and deploy countermeasures immediately. Sarah threw her aircraft into the same violent defensive maneuvering she had practiced the previous day, but with the added complexity of operating at low altitude where terrain became an additional hazard. She could see the enemy missile tracking across the sky toward her position, and she deployed chaff and flares while pulling maximum G-forces to avoid intercept. The missile passed close enough that she could feel its heat signature through her aircraft's sensors, but her countermeasures had been effective and the weapon missed its target. However, her defensive maneuvering had taken her aircraft down to extremely low altitude, and she was now flying through a valley where enemy infantry could engage her with small arms fire. Tracer rounds began streaking past her cockpit as enemy soldiers fired everything they had at the low-flying fighter aircraft. Sarah maintained maximum speed while climbing as rapidly as possible toward the relative safety of higher altitude, but several rounds struck her aircraft's armor plating with metallic impacts that were audible even over the engine noise. Falcon 4, what's your status? Williams called, having observed her low-altitude passage through the enemy infantry positions. Sarah quickly scanned her instruments and was relieved to see that all systems were showing normal indications. All systems green lead. Looks like their small arms fire didn't penetrate anything critical. Understood. Let's get some altitude and check in with ground forces for battle damage assessment. As they climbed toward a safer altitude, Sarah reflected on how quickly the tactical situation had changed. In less than 10 minutes, they had successfully destroyed 3 enemy tanks that posed an immediate threat to base defenses, but they had also been engaged by surface-to-air missiles and small arms fire that could easily have resulted in aircraft losses. Ground Pounder 6, this is Falcon Flight, Williams announced. All 3 enemy tanks have been destroyed. What's your current tactical situation? Falcon Flight, outstanding work. The immediate armor threat has been eliminated, but we're now receiving heavy mortar fire from positions approximately 2 kilometers to the northeast. Can you investigate and possibly engage those targets? Sarah looked toward the area the ground commander had indicated and could see the distinctive smoke signatures of mortar positions that were firing toward the base defenses. Mortars were difficult targets for air attack because they were small, mobile, and often concealed in prepared positions that provided protection from aerial observation. Ground Pounder 6 will investigate the mortar positions, but we're getting low on fuel and ordnance, Williams replied. We may need to return to base for resupply after this engagement. The mortar hunt required a different tactical approach than attacking tanks. Williams led them in a series of reconnaissance passes, flying at different altitudes and angles to locate the enemy weapons that were causing casualties among the base defenders. Sarah used her aircraft sensors to detect heat signatures and electronic emissions that might indicate mortar positions. After several minutes of searching, Sarah spotted muzzle flashes from a concealed position that appeared to be coordinating the mortar fire. Falcon lead. I have what looks like a command post approximately 1 kilometer northeast of the marked friendly positions. Multiple vehicles and personnel with communications equipment visible. Williams confirmed her observation and immediately planned an attack that would eliminate the enemy command post and disrupt their coordination of indirect fire against the base. Good spotting, 4. That's definitely a high-value target. Let's take it out with our remaining ordnance. The attack on the enemy command post was successful, resulting in multiple explosions and the immediate cessation of coordinated mortar fire against the base defenses. However, their extended time over the target area had attracted additional air defense activity, and both aircraft were now critically low on fuel. Falcon flight. Return to base immediately for refuel and rearm. Came the order from base operations. Falcon 5 and 6 are launching to continue close air support operations. As they flew back toward forward operating base Falcon, Sarah could see that the battle had intensified significantly during their mission. Smoke was rising from multiple locations around the base perimeter. Explosions were more frequent and closer to critical facilities, and the defensive fighting positions were clearly under severe pressure. Landing back at base required navigating between ongoing artillery impacts and the constant stream of aircraft, helicopters, and ground vehicles supporting the defensive operations. Sarah had never landed during an actual battle, and the experience was both terrifying and exhilarating. After shutdown, Sergeant Martinez was waiting with a damage assessment team to inspect her aircraft for battle damage from the small arms fire she had encountered. They found several bullet holes in non-critical areas, but all systems had continued functioning normally, and the aircraft would be ready for another mission after refueling and rearming. How many more times can we do this? Sarah asked Major Richards as she entered the operations center for post-mission debriefing. As many times as necessary, he replied simply. The enemy assault is just getting started, and our ground forces are going to need continuous air support for the next several days. Are you ready to go again? Sarah looked at the tactical displays showing enemy forces continuing to attack from multiple directions, friendly casualties mounting, and the overall situation remaining critical despite their successful missions. She thought about the ground forces who were counting on air support to survive, the importance of holding the base until relief forces arrived, and her own responsibilities as a member of the defending team. Yes, sir, she said. I'm ready to go again. The battle for forward operating base Falcon was far from over, and Sarah Chun was no longer the nervous pilot who had worried about her first combat mission. She was now a proven combat veteran who understood that her flying skills could make the difference between victory and defeat, between her fellow soldiers living or dying, and between holding the base or losing it to enemy forces. Her transformation from training pilot to combat aviator was complete, but the real test was still ahead. The runway stretched ahead of Sarah like a pathway to destiny. She had taxied down this same strip of concrete hundreds of times during training exercises, but everything felt different now. The weight of live ammunition in her aircraft's weapon bays, the knowledge that enemy forces were watching from the surrounding mountains, and the understanding that people would actually be trying to kill her in the next hour combined to create a sensation she had never experienced before. Control tower came through her headset with crisp, professional efficiency. Falcon flight, you are cleared for takeoff. Wind is calm, visibility unlimited. Be advised, radar has detected possible hostile aircraft activity approximately 50 kilometers to the northwest. Maintain radio contact and report any unusual activity immediately. Sarah acknowledged the clearance and glanced over at Morrison's aircraft, positioned alongside hers in standard formation takeoff position. Through his cockpit canopy, she could see him giving her a thumbs up, his face partially obscured by his oxygen mask, but his confidence clearly visible. They had practiced this exact scenario dozens of times, but never with the knowledge that enemy surface-to-air missiles might be tracking their every movement. The takeoff itself was routine, both aircraft lifting off smoothly and climbing rapidly toward their assigned altitude. Sarah felt the familiar sensation of acceleration pressing her back into her seat, the ground falling away below, and the aircraft responding precisely to her control inputs. For a moment, the sheer joy of flying pushed aside her concerns about the mission ahead. This was what she had always loved about aviation, the feeling of leaving earthbound limitations behind and entering a three-dimensional world where skill and knowledge mattered more than physical strength. As they climbed through 10,000 feet, Sarah began to notice the differences between training flights and real combat operations. The radio chatter was more intense, with multiple agencies coordinating defensive positions, reconnaissance flights, and logistical movements. Air traffic control was juggling not just her mission, but helicopter flights, supply drops, and surveillance aircraft, all while monitoring for possible enemy air activity. Falcon 2, this is Lead. Morrison's voice came through her headset. How are your systems looking? Sarah scanned her instruments quickly. Every gauge showed normal readings. All weapons systems were armed and ready, and her radar was painting a clear picture of the airspace around them. All systems green, Lead. Ready to proceed to target. They had switched to their tactical communication frequency, using call signs and coded language that would be difficult for enemy forces to interpret even if they were monitoring radio traffic. Morrison was flying as mission commander despite his relative inexperience, a decision that reflected the Air Force's confidence in his leadership abilities and tactical judgment. The flight toward their target took them over terrain that looked deceptively peaceful from altitude. Rolling hills covered with sparse vegetation, mountain ranges that appeared almost purple in the morning light, and occasional valleys where small settlements were visible as clusters of buildings. Sarah knew that somewhere below, thousands of enemy soldiers were preparing for an assault that could determine the fate of everyone at Forward Operating Base Falcon. 15 minutes into the flight, their peaceful transit was interrupted by an urgent transmission from base operations. Falcon Flight, be advised we have reports of enemy air defense activity in your target area. Recommend extreme caution and be prepared for evasive maneuvering. Sarah felt her heart rate increase as the reality of combat flying became more immediate. Air defense systems meant surface-to-air missiles, radar-guided guns, and the constant possibility that someone was tracking her aircraft and preparing to shoot it down. She adjusted her seat position slightly, checked her ejection seat safety pins one more time, and reviewed the emergency procedures that might save her life if everything went wrong. Understood, Control, Morrison replied. Falcon Flight will proceed with heightened awareness. Request any additional intelligence on specific threats. Falcon Flight, intelligence indicates possible SA-15 systems in the target area. Recommend approach from the southeast to minimize exposure time. SA-15 missiles were sophisticated weapons, capable of engaging multiple targets simultaneously and difficult to defeat with standard countermeasures. Sarah had studied them extensively during her training, but knowledge from textbooks was different from facing them in actual combat. She made mental notes about approach angles, evasive maneuvers, and the timing required to deploy chaff and flares effectively. As they approached the target area, Sarah could see why the enemy had chosen this location for their communications facility. The installation was positioned on a hilltop that provided excellent views in all directions, surrounded by natural terrain features that would make ground assault extremely difficult. Multiple antenna arrays were visible, along with several buildings and what appeared to be defensive positions around the perimeter. Falcon 2, I have visual contact with the target, Morrison announced. Can you confirm? Sarah adjusted her flight path slightly to get a better view of the objective. Confirmed, Lead. I count 4 major antenna arrays and approximately 6 support buildings. Looks like they've added some defensive positions since the last intelligence update. The tactical situation was more complex than their briefing had suggested. What intelligence had described as a lightly defended communications site now appeared to have multiple defensive positions, camouflaged vehicles, and signs of recent construction activity. Either their information had been wrong, or the enemy had significantly reinforced the position in the past 24 hours. Morrison's voice carried new tension as he processed the same observations. Control, this is Falcon Lead. Target appears more heavily defended than briefed. Request permission to abort and return to base for rebriefing. Sarah found herself hoping that Mission Control would approve the abort request. The target looked much more dangerous than expected, and military doctrine emphasized the importance of accurate intelligence for mission success. Attacking a heavily defended position without proper preparation was exactly the kind of mistake that got pilots killed and missions failed. The response from base operations was not what either pilot wanted to hear. Falcon Flight, negative on abort request. Target is critical to base defense operations. You are cleared to engage as briefed, but use maximum caution and abort individual attack runs if threat level becomes unacceptable. Sarah understood the strategic logic behind the order, but it didn't make the tactical situation any less dangerous. The communications facility was coordinating enemy operations across the entire region, and destroying it might significantly disrupt the planned assault on their base. However, the increased defenses meant that attacking it would require flying directly through multiple layers of air defense systems. Falcon 2, we're going to modify our attack profile, Morrison announced. Instead of the standard approach, we'll come in from the northwest, use the mountain ridge for cover, and attack in a single coordinated pass. That should minimize our exposure time to their defensive systems. Sarah studied the terrain ahead, visualizing the attack route Morrison was describing. It was more complicated than their original plan, requiring precise timing and coordination, but it offered a better chance of achieving surprise and reducing their time under fire. Copy lead. Northwest approach, single coordinated pass. What's our target priority? Primary target is the main communications array, that large tower cluster on the eastern side of the facility. Secondary targets are the support buildings if we have ordnance remaining after the primary attack. We go in fast, hit hard, and get out immediately. The modified attack plan made sense tactically, but it also meant that Sarah would be flying her first combat mission using a profile they had never practiced together. She would need to rely on her basic flying skills and adapt to Morrison's leadership in real time, all while people were actively trying to shoot them down. As they began their approach run, Sarah activated her aircraft's defensive systems, including electronic countermeasures designed to confuse enemy radar and decoy systems intended to attract missiles away from her aircraft. The heads-up display in her cockpit began showing potential threats, electronic signatures that might indicate air defense radars or missile systems. Falcon lead. I'm picking up search radar activity from the target area. Looks like they know we're coming. Confirmed, too. They've been tracking us for the past several minutes. Get ready for defensive maneuvering as soon as we release ordnance. Sarah felt sweat beginning to form inside her flight helmet despite the cockpit's climate control system. This was the moment she had trained for and dreaded in equal measure when abstract concepts like enemy threats became immediate and personal dangers. Somewhere below, soldiers were manning air defense systems specifically designed to kill pilots like her, and in the next few minutes, they would have multiple opportunities to succeed. The mountain ridge Morrison had selected for their approach provided excellent cover from most of the enemy defensive positions, but it also meant flying very close to rugged terrain at high speed. Sarah concentrated on maintaining proper formation position while monitoring her altitude carefully. Flying into a mountain would be just as fatal as being shot down by enemy missiles, and significantly more embarrassing. As they crested the ridge and the target facility came into view, Sarah could see that the enemy was indeed ready for them. Muzzle flashes from anti-aircraft guns were visible around the perimeter, and her radar warning receiver was screaming alerts about multiple missile systems tracking her aircraft. The peaceful-looking communications facility had transformed into a hornet's nest of defensive activity. Falcon Flight, we have multiple threats active, Morrison announced, his voice maintaining professional calm despite the dangerous situation. Beginning attack run in 3, 2, 1, execute. Both aircraft dove toward the target, building speed rapidly and presenting the most difficult possible shot for enemy gunners. Sarah could see tracer rounds streaking past her cockpit, creating an oddly beautiful but terrifying light show against the morning sky. Her training took over, and she found herself following Morrison's lead aircraft automatically, making small adjustments to maintain formation while preparing to release her weapons. The target was rushing toward them at incredible speed, growing larger in her windscreen with each passing second. Sarah could see individual buildings, vehicles, and even people running for cover as the two fighters screamed down from the mountain ridge. Her weapons system indicated target lock, and she prepared to release her ordnance on Morrison's signal. Fox 3. Morrison called, indicating that he had released his weapons toward the primary target. Sarah watched his missiles streak toward the main communications array, leaving thin trails of smoke behind them as they guided themselves toward impact. Fox 3. Sarah echoed, releasing her own weapons toward the secondary targets Morrison had assigned her. The aircraft lurched slightly as the heavy missiles departed their launch rails, and Sarah immediately began evasive maneuvering to avoid enemy fire during their escape from the target area. The next 30 seconds stretched like hours as both pilots fought to escape the deadly airspace around the enemy facility. Sarah's radar warning receiver continued its urgent alerts, indicating that multiple missile systems were tracking her aircraft and attempting to achieve firing solutions. She deployed chaff and flares in prescribed patterns, hoping to confuse enemy targeting systems while maintaining maximum speed toward the relative safety of the mountain ridge. Behind them, explosions erupted across the communications facility as their weapons found their targets. Sarah glanced back briefly and saw smoke and flames rising from multiple buildings, with the main antenna array collapsing in a tangle of twisted metal. Their attack had been successful, but they weren't safe yet. Falcon lead. I have missile launch indication from the target area, Sarah announced, her voice surprisingly steady despite the adrenaline coursing through her system. Confirmed, too. I see it. Deploy countermeasures and execute evasive maneuver pattern alpha. Sarah threw her aircraft into a violent series of turns and altitude changes, pushing the fighter to its performance limits while dispensing chaff and flares to confuse the incoming missile. The aircraft groaned under the G-forces, and she felt the familiar sensation of blood draining from her head as centrifugal force tried to overcome her body's circulation system. Through her peripheral vision, she could see the enemy missile tracking across the sky, a small white streak that represented imminent death if it achieved intercept. Time seemed to slow as she watched the weapon's trajectory, calculating intercept angles and timing while simultaneously maneuvering to avoid it. The missile passed less than 100 meters from her aircraft, close enough that she could see its control fins adjusting as it tried to correct course for a second attempt. However, her countermeasures had been effective, and the weapon flew past harmlessly before self-destructing when it ran out of fuel. Falcon 2, you're clear of immediate threats, Morrison announced. Form up on my wing, and let's get back to base. Outstanding work on your first combat mission. As they climbed away from the target area and began their return flight, Sarah felt a complex mixture of emotions. Relief at having survived her first real combat experience. Pride at having performed well under pressure. Excitement at the successful completion of their mission objectives. And underlying all of those feelings, a new understanding of what combat flying really meant. The radio chatter during their return flight included updates from multiple sources. Ground forces at Forward Operating Base Falcon reported that enemy communications activity had dropped significantly following their attack. Intelligence analysts confirmed that the communications facility had been effectively destroyed, with primary and secondary targets showing complete loss of functionality. Other aircraft reported reduced enemy coordination in their operational areas, suggesting that the mission had achieved its strategic objectives. As Forward Operating Base Falcon came into view ahead of them, Sarah could see increased activity around the perimeter defenses. Soldiers were reinforcing positions, artillery was being repositioned, and additional air defense systems were being deployed. Everyone was preparing for the enemy assault that intelligence believed would come within the next 24 hours. Landing back at base felt different from any training flight Sarah had ever completed. The runway looked the same, the procedures were identical, and her aircraft performed exactly as expected. But everything had changed. She was no longer a pilot who had never seen combat. She was a veteran who had successfully completed a dangerous mission under fire. After shutdown, as she climbed out of her cockpit and began her post-flight inspection, Sergeant Martinez approached with a broad smile on his weathered face. "How did she fly, Captain?" he asked, referring to the aircraft with the affection that experienced crew chiefs always showed for their machines. "Perfectly, Sergeant," Sarah replied. "She brought me home safely, and that's all I can ask for." Morrison joined them, pulling off his flight helmet and running his hand through sweat-dampened hair. "Outstanding flying, Captain Chun. You handled that like a veteran. I couldn't have asked for a better wingman on my first combat mission as flight lead." Sarah realized that both of them had achieved important personal milestones during the same mission. Morrison had successfully led his first combat flight, while she had proven herself capable of performing under fire. They had both crossed an invisible line that separated training from the real thing. Major Richards was waiting for them in the operations center, along with intelligence officers who wanted immediate debriefing on what they had observed at the target site. The conversation that followed was detailed and technical, covering everything from enemy defensive positions to battle damage assessment to lessons learned for future missions. "The good news," Richards concluded after hearing their report, "is that you've successfully eliminated a critical enemy capability right when they needed it most. The bad news is that they're going to be very angry about it, and they'll probably accelerate their timeline for attacking our base." Sarah understood the implications immediately. Their successful mission had improved the defensive situation for Forward Operating Base Falcon, but it had also made their personal situation more dangerous. The enemy would now know that the base had active fighter aircraft capable of striking their positions, and they would undoubtedly develop countermeasures and adjust their tactics accordingly. As she walked back to her quarters to change out of her flight gear and grab some food, Sarah reflected on how much had changed in just a few hours. That morning, she had been an inexperienced pilot worrying about proving herself in combat. Now she was a veteran who had successfully completed a critical mission under fire and was already thinking about the next challenge ahead. The enemy assault on Forward Operating Base Falcon was still coming, probably within the next day or two. When it arrived, she would be ready to fly again, to support the ground forces defending their base, and to continue proving that training, preparation, and determination mattered more than gender or previous experience. Her first combat mission was complete, but the real test was just beginning. Captain Sarah Chun had always known this day would come. Not the exact day, not the precise circumstances, but the moment when everything she had trained for would be put to the ultimate test. She stood at the window of the briefing room at Forward Operating Base Falcon, watching the distant mountains where enemy forces had been gathering for weeks. The morning sun cast long shadows across the runway, and the air was thick with tension that had been building like a storm cloud on the horizon. The base was home to 3,000 military personnel, including a small but elite squadron of combat pilots. Sarah was the only woman among the 12 fighter pilots stationed there, a fact that had followed her through every assignment, every promotion, and every conversation in the mess hall. She had learned to carry that distinction with quiet pride rather than defensive anger. Her father, a retired Air Force colonel, had taught her that respect was earned in the cockpit, not in arguments. At 28, Sarah had accumulated over 800 flight hours, but every single one had been in training exercises or routine patrols. She had joined the Air Force 7 years earlier with dreams of serving her country and proving that gender meant nothing when you were strapped into $30 million worth of cutting-edge fighter aircraft. Her instructors had praised her precision, her calm under pressure, and her ability to make split-second decisions that could mean the difference between mission success and catastrophic failure. The intelligence reports had been growing increasingly dire over the past month. Enemy forces, well-armed and highly organized, had been moving through the mountain passes, establishing positions that formed an ever-tightening noose around the base. What had started as scattered insurgent activity had evolved into something much more sophisticated and dangerous. Satellite imagery showed coordinated movement patterns, heavy equipment being transported under cover of darkness, and the systematic establishment of defensive positions that suggested a major offensive was imminent. Major Richards, the squadron commander, had called an emergency briefing for 0600 hours. Sarah arrived 15 minutes early, as was her habit, and found herself alone in the briefing room with maps, charts, and classified documents spread across every available surface. The situation looked worse on paper than it did from her window. Red markers indicated confirmed enemy positions, forming an almost complete circle around the base. Blue markers showed friendly forces, looking pitifully outnumbered and isolated. The other pilots began filing in, their faces grim and focused. These were men she had trained with, flown beside, and shared countless meals within the mess hall. Lieutenant Torres, a hotshot from Texas who never met a risk he wouldn't take. Captain Williams, methodical and precise, who studied every mission detail until he could recite them in his sleep. Lieutenant Morrison, barely 23 but already showing the instincts of a veteran pilot. Each of them nodded to Sarah as they took their seats, the usual morning banter replaced by the weight of what they all sensed was coming. Major Richards entered exactly at 6 o'clock, his expression revealing nothing but his posture suggesting everything. He was a 20-year veteran who had flown combat missions over 3 different theaters of operation. Sarah had never seen him look worried, but this morning, something was different. He moved to the front of the room and activated the large display screen, showing a real-time satellite view of their situation. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, his voice carrying the authority of command and the gravity of the moment. "We have a situation that requires immediate and decisive action. As of 0530 this morning, enemy forces have completed their encirclement of forward operating base Falcon. We are effectively surrounded by an estimated 5,000 hostile combatants with significant heavy weapons capability." The room fell silent except for the hum of the air conditioning system and the distant sound of helicopters conducting routine patrols. Sarah felt her heart rate increase slightly, but her breathing remained steady. This was what she had trained for, what she had dreamed of, and secretly feared in equal measure. Major Richards continued, his pointer moving across the display to highlight key positions. "Intelligence suggests they plan to launch a coordinated assault within the next 24 to 48 hours. Their objective appears to be the complete capture or destruction of this facility and the elimination of all personnel. This is not a harassment campaign or a probe. This is a full-scale military operation designed to achieve decisive results." Lieutenant Torres shifted in his seat, the leather creaking slightly. "What about reinforcements, sir? Can we expect support from other bases in the region?" The major's expression darkened slightly. "Negative. The nearest friendly forces are over 300 miles away, and the enemy has established air defense systems that make conventional reinforcement extremely dangerous. We're on our own for the immediate future. Command is working on relief operations, but we need to assume we'll be fighting this battle without external support for at least 72 hours. Captain Williams raised his hand. "What about evacuation? Can we get non-essential personnel out before the shooting starts?" "Also negative," Richards replied. "All approaches to the base are under enemy observation and control. Any attempt to evacuate by ground or air would result in significant casualties. We fight from here, or we don't fight at all." Sarah found herself studying the tactical display with new intensity. The enemy positions were expertly chosen, taking advantage of natural terrain features and creating overlapping fields of fire that would make any escape attempt extremely costly. Whoever was commanding the opposing force clearly understood military tactics and had planned this operation with impressive precision. "Our mission," Major Richards continued, "is to provide close air support for our ground forces and to disrupt enemy operations through targeted strikes on their command and control infrastructure. We'll be operating from a base that's under siege, with limited resupply capability and no margin for error. Every sortie will be critical, and every pilot will need to perform at their absolute best." He paused, making eye contact with each pilot in turn. When his gaze met Sarah's, she saw something that might have been concern, but also unmistakable confidence. "I want to be clear about something. This squadron has trained together for 18 months. We know each other's capabilities, strengths, and limitations. When we launch as a team, and we fight as a team. Experience in combat is valuable, but it's not everything. Training, preparation, and trust in your wingman matter more than how many missions you've flown in anger. Sarah understood the subtext immediately. Half the pilots in the room had combat experience from previous deployments. The other half, including herself, would be flying their first combat missions. The major was sending a message that inexperience was not disqualification, that the team was stronger than any individual weakness. "Sir," Sarah heard herself saying, "what's our expected mission duration? How long do we need to hold out?" "Excellent question, Captain Chen. Our defensive plan assumes a minimum of 72 hours before relief forces can reach us. Maximum estimate is 1 week. We have sufficient fuel and ordnance for sustained operations during that period, assuming we manage our resources carefully and achieve reasonable success rates on our missions." The briefing continued for another 30 minutes, covering everything from communication protocols to emergency procedures. Sarah absorbed every detail, committing radio frequencies, rendezvous points, and backup plans to memory. She had always been good at retaining information under pressure, a skill that had served her well throughout her training and would be essential in the coming battle. As the other pilots filed out to begin pre-flight preparations, Major Richards gestured for Sarah to remain behind. She felt a moment of uncertainty, wondering if he was having second thoughts about including her in the combat roster. Instead, he moved to the window and gestured for her to join him. "Captain, I want you to know that you're going to be flying today not because of political correctness or because someone in Washington thinks we need diversity in our cockpits. You're flying because you're one of the best pilots in this squadron, and we need every capable aviator we can get." Sarah nodded, appreciating his directness. "Thank you, sir. I won't let the squadron down." "I know you won't," he replied. "But I also know that flying your first combat mission while your base is under siege is about as challenging as it gets. The enemy knows our capabilities, they've studied our tactics, and they'll be specifically looking to shoot down our aircraft. This isn't going to be like anything you've experienced in training." She looked out at the runway where ground crews were already preparing aircraft for the day's missions. "Sir, can I ask you something?" "Shoot. How did you feel before your first combat mission?" Major Richards was quiet for a moment, and Sarah wondered if she had asked something too personal. Then he smiled slightly, the first time she had seen him do so all morning. "Terrified," he said simply. "Absolutely terrified. But also excited, if that makes sense. All that training, all those hours in simulators and practice ranges, and finally, you get the chance to do the job for real. The fear doesn't go away, but you learn to use it. Fear keeps you sharp, keeps you making good decisions. It's when pilots stop being afraid that they start making mistakes." Sarah found this reassuring in an unexpected way. She had been worried that her nervousness was a sign of weakness, but hearing that even experienced pilots felt fear made her feel more normal, more human. "The key," Richards continued, "is to trust your training and trust your team. You know how to fly that aircraft better than most people know how to drive a car. Your reflexes are sharp, your knowledge is complete, and your judgment is sound. When you're up there, don't overthink it. Fly the mission, follow your training, and bring yourself and your wingman home safely." They stood in comfortable silence for several minutes, watching the activity on the flight line increase as the base prepared for what everyone knew would be a difficult day. Sarah could see weapons being loaded onto aircraft, fuel trucks moving between hardened shelters, and maintenance crews conducting final inspections with the intensity that comes from knowing lives depend on their work. "There's something else," Richards said. "I'm assigning Lieutenant Morrison as your wingman for today's mission. He's young, but he's got good instincts and he follows orders well. More importantly, he doesn't have any preconceived notions about female pilots. Some of the older guys have been around long enough to have opinions that might not be helpful in a combat situation." Sarah appreciated the consideration, though she hoped she would eventually earn the respect of all her squadron mates through performance rather than careful personnel management. "What's our target assignment?" "Enemy communications array approximately 15 kilometers north of the base. Intelligence believes it's a key coordination point for their operations. If we can take it out, it might disrupt their timing for the main assault. It's a challenging target, well defended, but within the capabilities of a two-ship formation." Sarah felt her pulse quicken. This wasn't just busy work or a milk run designed to ease her into combat gradually. This was a real mission with real strategic importance, the kind of assignment that could make a difference in the outcome of the battle. Wheels up in 2 hours, Richards concluded. Get some breakfast, review your mission materials one more time, and then get suited up. And Captain? Yes, sir. Welcome to combat aviation. As Sarah left the briefing room and walked across the base toward the mess hall, she was struck by how normal everything looked despite the extraordinary circumstances. Soldiers were going about their morning routines. Maintenance crews were working on vehicles and equipment, and the base operations continued with the same efficiency that characterized military life everywhere. The only signs of the crisis were the increased guard presence at the perimeter and the tension visible in everyone's faces. The mess hall was busier than usual, with personnel grabbing quick meals before reporting to duty stations. Sarah got her usual breakfast of scrambled eggs, toast, and coffee, but found that her appetite was significantly reduced by anticipation and nervousness. She sat at a table near the window, picking at her food while reviewing the mission briefing materials one more time. Lieutenant Morrison joined her, carrying a tray loaded with what looked like enough food for 3 people. At 23, he had the metabolism and appetite of someone who could eat continuously without gaining weight, a fact that was the subject of considerable envy among the older pilots. "Morning, Captain," he said, his voice carrying a slight southern accent that became more pronounced when he was nervous. "Ready for our big day?" Sarah smiled at his enthusiasm. Morrison's excitement was genuine and infectious, reminding her why she had wanted to become a pilot in the first place. "Ready as I'll ever be, Lieutenant. How are you feeling about it?" "Honestly, scared out of my mind, but in a good way. This is what we signed up for, right? All that training, all those hours in the simulator, and now we get to do it for real. I mean, I know people could die, and this is serious business, but there's also a part of me that's just excited to finally find out what I'm really made of." His honesty was refreshing, and Sarah found herself relaxing slightly. She had been so focused on her own concerns about being the only woman in the squadron that she had forgotten that most of the other pilots were also dealing with their own anxieties and uncertainties. "Have you talked to any of the guys who flew combat missions and other deployments?" she asked. Morrison nodded, swallowing a large bite of pancakes before answering. "Yeah, Captain Williams gave me some advice last night. He said the main thing is to stick to your training and not try to be a hero. Fly the mission, accomplish the objectives, and get home safely. He also said that combat flying is different from training because people are actually trying to kill you, but that the aircraft performs the same way and the controls work the same way. So if you know how to fly in training, you know how to fly in combat." Sarah found this perspective helpful. She had been thinking about her first combat mission as something completely different from everything she had done before, but Morrison's comment reminded her that flying was flying, whether the targets were practice ranges or real enemy positions. They finished breakfast in companionable silence, each lost in their own thoughts about the mission ahead. As they prepared to leave, Morrison turned to Sarah with a serious expression. "Captain, can I ask you something?" "Of course. Are you worried about being the only woman on the mission? I mean, not about your flying abilities or anything like that, but about how people might react or what kind of pressure that puts on you." Sarah considered the question carefully. It was something she had thought about extensively, but no one had ever asked her directly. "Yes and no," she said finally. "Yes, because I know that if I make a mistake, some people will attribute it to my gender rather than just human error. But no, because once I'm in that cockpit, it's just me and the aircraft and the mission. The aircraft doesn't care what gender I am, and neither do the enemy missiles." Morrison grinned. "That's a good way to think about it. For what it's worth, everyone in the squadron knows you're a hell of a pilot. Gender doesn't make you better or worse at flying. It just makes you different, and different can be good in a combat situation." As they walked toward the flight line, Sarah reflected on how much her perspective had changed in just the past few hours. When she woke up that morning, she had been focused on her own anxieties and concerns about proving herself. Now, talking with Morrison and remembering Major Richard's confidence in her abilities, she felt more like part of a team facing a challenge together rather than an individual trying to prove something to skeptical colleagues. The flight line was a hive of activity, with ground crews conducting final preparations on a dozen different aircraft. Sarah could see her assigned fighter, tail number 447, receiving its final inspection from Sergeant Martinez, a veteran crew chief who had been working on combat aircraft longer than Sarah had been alive. Martinez took personal pride in every aircraft under his care, and Sarah had never seen him sign off on a plane that wasn't in perfect condition. "Morning, Captain," Martinez called out as she approached. "Your bird is ready to fly. All systems check out perfect, weapons are loaded and armed, and fuel is topped off." She's never been in better condition. Sarah conducted her own pre-flight inspection, walking around the aircraft and checking every system, control surface, and weapon mount. This was partly regulation and partly ritual, a way of connecting with the machine that would soon be carrying her into combat. The fighter was a technological marvel, capable of flying faster than sound and delivering precision weapons with devastating accuracy. In the right hands, it was one of the most effective combat systems ever created. Morrison was conducting his own pre-flight inspection at the next hardened shelter, and Sarah could see him following the same methodical process she was using. Their aircraft would launch together, fly together, and hopefully return together. In combat aviation, your wingman was more than just another pilot. They were your backup, your second set of eyes, and often the person who would bring you home safely when things went wrong. As Sarah completed her inspection and began putting on her flight gear, she thought about all the people who had helped her reach this moment. Her father, who had encouraged her to pursue her dreams despite the obstacles. Her flight instructors, who had pushed her to excel without making allowances for her gender. Her fellow pilots, who had accepted her as a team member based on her abilities rather than her demographics. And Major Richards, who was trusting her with a critical mission despite her lack of combat experience. The weight of that trust was significant, but it was also motivating. Sarah had spent years preparing for this moment, and she was as ready as training and determination could make her. In less than an hour, she would be airborne, flying toward an enemy that wanted to kill her and everyone she served with. It was terrifying and exhilarating in equal measure. She climbed into the cockpit and began the startup sequence, running through checklists that she knew by heart, but verified anyway. Each switch, each gauge, each system had to be perfect because there would be no second chances once the mission began. The aircraft came to life around her, instruments glowing, engines warming up, and systems indicating ready status across the board. Through her headset, she could hear Morrison completing his own startup sequence and the control tower beginning to coordinate the morning's flight operations. In a few minutes, they would taxi to the runway, receive final clearance, and launch into a situation that would test everything they had learned and everything they believed about themselves. Sarah Chun was about to fly her first combat mission, and she was ready.